Before starting the video, I want you to answer a question. I have this physical body. I say this is me. But if I lose an arm, is that body still me? If my organs are transplanted into another person's body, where is my self then? If we analyze it further, this body is made up of smaller cells, molecules, and atoms. So where is the self anymore? Today, let's explore the concept of anatta, one of the core teachings of Buddhism. It is also one of the most profound and difficult to understand concepts, so I ask that you keep an open mind and focus until the end of the video. I believe you will not be disappointed. In fact, this video may completely change your perception of the world and help you become a happier person. From the moment we are born, we grow up, mature, age, get sick, and eventually die. Even after death, we think that there is something invisible that has the power to control us, our thoughts and actions. Some people call it the soul, others call it the ego, and still others call it consciousness. But we call it the self. We think that there is only one self within us, and that this self does not change over time. In other words, the self has the property of permanent existence. According to Buddhism, this permanent existence is called attavada. From this attavada arises attasneha, which means to love, care for, and protect the self. Because we love ourself so much, our lives are caught up in the cycle of birth and death. Instead of living a noble life, we become slaves to satisfying the desires of the self, because we are afraid that one day we will lose it completely. So what is anatta? First, we need to distinguish between anatta and impermanence. We say that humans are impermanent because we clearly see ourselves changing and transforming in every moment, both biologically and in terms of our thoughts. We gradually change in form, and we all experience birth, aging, sickness, and death. However, to say that we are anatta, we must look through the lens of dependent origination. In this view, humans are a collection of karmic conditions, of the sum total of family, social relationships, cultivation, and development. Many other ideologies have also addressed the concept of impermanence. For example, when standing on the riverbank looking down at the flowing water, the great philosopher Heraclitus said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." Confucius wrote in the Analects, "The water flows endlessly, day and night without stopping. Is it always like this?" Both Confucianism and Western philosophy generally have a concept of impermanence, but they do not seem to have a concept of anatta in all things. Therefore, it can be said that the Buddha's teaching of anatta is a revolutionary and great teaching. In the second sermon at this garden, the Anatta Sutta, the Buddha taught the anatta nature of the 5 aggregates of a human being as follows. This body, monks, is anatta. If there were a self in the body, would the body then be subject to suffering? And could one command the body to be as one wishes? Let the body be thus. Let the body not be thus. But since there is no self in the body, therefore the body is subject to suffering, and one cannot command the body to be as one wishes. The remaining aggregates are feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. All 5 aggregates create a false notion of a self or an unchanging entity. From this self, it is easy for beings to give rise to attachment, clinging, and conservatism. Lack of reflection and consideration in our actions towards the reality of anatta of all things is often the path that leads to suffering and sorrow. Therefore, anatta is a unique teaching in Buddhism that there is no permanent, unchanging, and independent self. Everything exists due to dependent origination. In other words, things arise because of prior conditions and have no power to arise on their own. The cessation of things also occurs due to dependent origination. The truth of no self. Correctly understanding the psychophysical activities of oneself is to have a clear view of the three Dharma seals of impermanence, suffering, and non-self of the five aggregates. As long as human thoughts are still bound by the notions of the permanence and eternity of the self and the method of wrong perception, the three Dharma seals still have value and exist in the world. Scientific discoveries also prove that non-self is a truth. For example, our brain has billions of cells, but there is no master cell that gives orders to transmit information to each other until a thought arises. It is the result of all neurons. Neuroscientists say that the human brain is like an orchestra in which each musician plays an instrument, but there is no conductor. The body we have is made up of countless cells, and no cell claims to be the master. We think that we need to have a self to escape from samsara and enter nirvana. Without a self, who escapes from samsara? Who enters nirvana? Who sees? Who hears? Who cultivates? Who creates karma? And who receives the karmic retribution? Without a self, who sees, who understands the Dharma? Sometimes the doctrine of no self causes confusion and misunderstanding. Whenever we say, I am speaking, or I am walking, I am eating, I am watching this video, how can we deny the reality of the self? Buddhists should remember that the Buddha did not tell us to deny the use of the words I or me. Even the Buddha himself had to use a word to refer to himself, such as Tathagata. No matter what this word means, it is still a word or a name. When the Buddha taught about no self, he emphasized the renunciation of the notion that I am a permanent and unchanging entity. He said that the five aggregates of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness are not the self, and that there is no self to be found in these five aggregates. The Buddha's negation means the negation of a belief in a real, independent entity. It is no longer called the self, because such an entity must be independent, permanent, unchanging, and not subject to change. But such an entity cannot be found anywhere. When the Buddha introduced the concept of no self, he overturned many ideas about the universe and human life. The Buddha struck a major blow to the most popular and persistent notion of mankind at that time, the notion of the existence of a permanent self. Those who understand no self know that it is put forward to replace the notion of self, rather than a new truth of reality. The concept of no self is a means, not an end. If it becomes a notion, it also needs to be broken down like many other notions. Except for the Dharma of no self, there is no self, no self-control. We can divide no self into three categories: no self of the body, no self of the mind, and no self of the environment. The first is the no self of the body, which is impermanent and cannot be controlled. We cannot make it stay young and not die. Even the highest level of meditation can only preserve the body for a certain period of time. The second is the no self of the mind, which refers to the vain thoughts of sentient beings that cannot be controlled, such as thoughts of greed, anger, sadness, joy, and sorrow. They come and go quickly. Nothing is real. The third is the no self of the environment, which is like an illusion and cannot be controlled. Cities change, prices go up and down, fields are abandoned, and oil turns into sea. Everything is constantly changing in every moment. One scene disappears and another appears. The Buddha used the following analysis to prove that the self can never be found in the body or in the mind. Speaking of the body is not the self, because if the body is the self must be permanent, unchanging, not decaying, not perishable, and not dying. Therefore, the body cannot be the self. The body is weak, tired, and old, contrary to what we want. The appearance of the body often does not follow our wishes. Therefore, it cannot be said that the self has a body. If we search from head to toe, we cannot find where the self is. The self is not in the bones, blood, marrow, hair, or saliva. The self cannot be found anywhere in the body. The self is not in the body. If the body is in the self must be found separately from the body and mind, but the self cannot be found anywhere. Speaking of the mind is not the self because it is like a monkey, constantly changing and always restless. The mind is sometimes happy and sometimes sad, so the mind. On this channel, my goal is to share the valuable lessons I've learned from my own experiences and the inspiring teachers in my life, all aimed at empowering you. I hold on to the dream of a world where everyone strives to improve daily, and where a fulfilling life is a right, not a privilege. Thank you for watching.